the definition that I have written in the book, and this is from page 5 of the book. And so when I talk about decentering whiteness, I'm talking about actions and behaviors that prioritize, uplift, amplify, and venerate white people and white dominant culture above other cultures and communities. And so in the first book talk that I did, it was a really interesting time because it was December of last year. And I know I shared this in the first book talk, but I don't think anyone was here for that book talk. Well, an interesting thing happened. So right during Thanksgiving of last year, I wrote this article on 3 ways to decenter whiteness in the workplace. Forbes posted the article on their Twitter page and it went viral. And JD Vance actually tweeted about it. I was not really familiar with JD Vance then. And of course, this was before he was Trump's VP pick. And so he tweeted about the article, and then I got all of this backlash. And I'm not really on Twitter much, but it was like so much vitriol and backlash that came from that article. And it was obvious that JD Vance and all of the people, Vivek Ramaswamy, all of the people that were tweeting at me for writing the article didn't understand what whiteness was and what whiteness meant. And what's important to mention is that whiteness is a system that doesn't need white people to actually prosper, right? Me as a Black person, in the book, I talk about how I center whiteness and how I prioritize whiteness in my own life. And so when I talk about whiteness, I'm talking about a system that prioritizes white dominant and Eurocentric culture above every other culture and system. And so how does that show up in the workplace is really what the book is focused on, and then also providing strategies to address it. And so today we're going to be focusing on empathy, right? Because I used to be a really big advocate for empathy. I was one of those people. I wrote this article on, empathy and why empathy is, the key to diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And I'm sure we're all familiar with empathy. We know what it means. And this is an article I wrote actually from 2018. And where I said empathy is the key to a diverse and inclusive workplace. And I look back now at the article and I kind of cringe because I've sort of evolved in my understanding of empathy. And so when I talk about empathy, I'm talking about this definition, which is from Catalyst, which says that empathy is the skill of connecting with others to identify and understand their thoughts, perspectives, and emotions, and demonstrating that understanding with intention, care, and concern. We hear the term, especially those of us, I'm not sure if any of you are engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, or if any of you are in the DEI space, but this is a term that we use a lot when we talk about, how to get people to have more empathy for those who are more marginalized than them. And I used to be one of those people, I say I was drinking the empathy Kool-Aid, right? Where I thought that all we had to do to better this world, to end racism, was get people to be more empathetic. It was to get people to be able to put themselves in the shoes of others and understand people's experiences. But when I started learning more and reading more about empathy, I realized that empathy in and of itself is actually flawed and is biased, and our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others is biased. And so I wanted to share with you all, I had an opportunity to meet Jane Elliott, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but if you're not familiar with Jane Elliott, she was a teacher. She really, what popularized her or put her in the spotlight was she did this brown-eyed, blue-eyed study on Oprah in the 90s, where she was trying to teach people in Oprah's audience about racism. And so what she did was she divided them into 2 groups, whoever had blue eyes and whoever had brown eyes. And what she was trying to do was, make people understand what it feels like to have brown skin. And I think in the exercise, she had the people with blue eyes treat the people with brown eyes differently, right? And so that was supposed to show this is what Black people experience. And so in 2019, I got an email from someone who was like, hey, Jane Elliott is going to be in Philadelphia. We have free tickets for you to see her if you want. We know you're in the DEI space. So I was familiar with Jane Elliott. I brought a friend of mine. And so we came into the audience. She was in this big building, and there were a lot of people in the audience. And so when you I guess, Meet with Jane Elliott, she does this exercise where she asks the audience a series of questions. And one of the questions that she asked the audience was, how many of you would want to be Black for a day? And so that's the question she asked. And me and my friend that were there were one of the few Black people that were in the audience. And so obviously she's not going to ask us, but she was asking the different people in the audience, how many of you would want to be Black for a day? And everyone kind of like looked down or looked at their shoes, and no one really, admitted that they would want to be Black for a day. And she was like, exactly. None of you would want to be Black for a day. How do you think it feels to be a Black person? Right. And so that was her like way of sort of inducing empathy and helping people to try to, put themselves in the shoes of Black people. And I walked away from that experience just feeling I felt like it was really demeaning as a Black person. I felt like no one in the audience wanted to be a Black person for a day. And I understood the purpose of like what she was doing, and she was trying to induce empathy, but I just felt like it came at the cost of me and my humanity and how my friend and I, felt. And so a lot of the work and the activities and the exercises that people are doing to try to eradicate racism involve trying to induce empathy and trying to make people feel what others feel and put themselves in the shoes of Black people specifically. But I'm here to really help us understand why that's not effective and not efficient, and why empathy in and of itself is flawed. So in the book, I write in chapter 7 this quote right here. And so one of my issues with empathy is that empathy is not action oriented. Empathy is a feeling that we feel, right? And so I might be able to put myself in the shoes of someone who has a more marginalized experience than I do. But at the end of the day, that will not change the systems and structures that led to the marginalization in the first place. So trying to elicit empathy by asking the types of questions that Elliot asks, which are dehumanizing to Black people, doesn't actually change the systems and structures that continue to harm Black and oppress Black people. And so really, like, when we're thinking about like what it's going to take to address whiteness, decenter whiteness, and eradicate racism, we have to think beyond empathy, because empathy is biased. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this term, the missing white woman syndrome, but in the book I talk about, this as an example of how our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others is biased. The other day it was funny because my partner was watching, they have like on Netflix or Hulu or something, this documentary on Lacey Peterson or Scott Peterson. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it. And so when he put it on, I was like, oh, this is like, I remember this story, right? And so I started talking to him about the missing white woman syndrome. And he was like, what is that? Like, what do you mean? And I explained to him, that how many of us know about these stories? How many of us have heard about Natalie Holloway, Lacey Peterson, Gabby Petito? I remember, I'm a 90s baby, so I remember JonBenet Ramsey. And when I was a kid, that's all that they used to show. And I remember my mom used to watch, my parents used to watch them talk about JonBenet Ramsey over and over and over again. And for those of you who aren't familiar, JonBenet Ramsey was a young girl who was missing and ended up, her body was found in her parents' basement. And I believe she was in Colorado. And so the story of like what happened to JonBenet Ramsey, she was a beauty pageant queen. She was a beautiful little girl. And that's the story that was on the news constantly. And I remember even, in my teenage years, hearing this story about Natalie Holloway going to Aruba with her mom and ended up missing, hearing the story about Lacey Peterson and even more recently, Gabby Petito. And when I sat and I thought about those stories, I couldn't think about, in like my whole 30-something years of living, I can't remember a single Black, Indigenous, or Asian child that went missing, or person that went missing, that I remember their name and their story, right? Especially growing up. And so missing white woman syndrome is this phenomenon where we're more captivated by the stories of white women that go missing. We have more empathy for the stories of white women that go missing than we do of people from racially marginalized groups and communities. And so our ability to even empathize with these women is more than women of other races. And so when we think about empathy and why empathy is flawed, part of the reason is because our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others is actually biased. And so I stumbled on this book, which is an amazing book. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of he's a psychologist and a researcher, Paul Bloom. I believe he was a Harvard researcher. I'm not sure if he's still teaching at Harvard, but he does a lot of research around aggression. He had a segment on 2020 where he did like a research study with babies, and essentially he and his researchers showed that babies aren't born with a blank slate, and essentially like babies are biased and babies have a tendency to like certain things. And so his research is really interesting. I recommend you check him out. But Paul Bloom had this book called Against Empathy, and in the book he talks about in a lot of detail why our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others is biased, and why he himself doesn't actually think that empathy is a good thing. And I read the book, I listened to it on Audible, and I was like, this book is amazing. And so a lot of the information that I wrote about in chapter 7 was actually some of the studies that Paul Bloom talked about. And so one of the things he talks about is the spotlight effect of empathy, right? And so specifically, he talks about how, he brought up 2 cases, and he talked about how the very tragic shooting of those 26 people in Newtown, Connecticut, where most of the victims were those young, children. He talked about how people had more empathy for that situation, and we saw it on the news, we all remember, than the amount of young Black kids that are killed in Chicago every day. And so he brought up the numbers, and he said the number of Black kids that are killed in Chicago every day vastly outnumbers the number of kids that were harmed and killed during that horrific tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. But we are more likely to empathize with the situation in Connecticut because of who the victims actually are. And so one of the problems with empathy is that it has the spotlight effect, right? Where if we're busy feeling empathy for one person or a thing or group, it is hard for us to also feel empathy for another person or thing. And so I never thought about that, where our ability to empathize is not unlimited, right? And so if I have empathy for you, the amount of empathy that I have for this person and that person and that person is not unlimited. And so one of the problems is that, of the spotlight effect, when we're focusing on one person or thing or group, it's hard for us to also have empathy for another person or thing or group. Right. And so another thing that Bloom talked about in his book that I wrote about is that, our empathy is biased, and that the research actually indicates that we have less empathy for highly successful people. Right. And so we see this a lot with celebrities, like when things happen to celebrities, we don't always have empathy for them, because if you're rich, if you're famous, and something horrible happens to you, we're more likely to kind of just be like, it is what it is, oh, well, too bad that thing happened to that person. We also have less empathy for people that are different from us, right? So if I'm a Black person, I may have a certain amount of empathy for another Black person, but if I see someone who's different than me, of a different race or gender or identity, I'm more likely to have less empathy for that person. We also have less empathy for those who we think are responsible for their own misfortune. And so it's interesting because if you have a certain perspective about someone who is homeless or someone who's unhoused, and you think, well, they should just go out and get a job, you're less likely to have empathy for that person, because maybe you think they are responsible for their own misfortune. We are more likely to have empathy for people who are like us. And so empathy, just as a blanket sort of solution, have more empathy, just put yourself in the shoes of others, doesn't actually solve a lot of the issues of racism and oppression that we face in this world. So our ability to empathize with others is actually biased. There is something called the racial empathy bias that I've written about a lot. I didn't mention this in the beginning, but outside of consulting for organizations, what I also do is I'm a writer. And one of the things that I've written about is the racial empathy bias. And we see this a lot in medicine, where people actually think that Black people have thicker skin than other racial groups. They've done studies on this. They've looked at physicians and medical professionals. And what they actually found is that on average, medical professionals prescribe pain medication they're less likely to prescribe it to Black people. And when they do prescribe them with pain medication, it's at lower dosages than their white counterparts. So there is this idea that Black people feel less pain, and therefore, when it comes to the pain and suffering that Black people are experiencing, we're less likely to feel empathy for them. And so, especially in the DEI space, when people talk about empathy, I kind of just cringe now because I know that empathy is not like the silver bullet that we think that it is. So two quotes that I want to share with you. I don't know if you all remember when the war in Ukraine happened. And so in early 2022, we heard a lot about what was happening between Russia and Ukraine. And so this was a quote from the senior foreign correspondent for CBS News, who said that Ukraine, quote unquote, isn't a place like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflicts raging for decades. He said this is a relatively civilized, relatively European city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. So he was just talking about how disturbing what was happening in Ukraine was, and between Russia and Ukraine was. And this quote was even more disturbing. This is from the former deputy prosecutor general of Ukraine, who said that the conflict was particularly disturbing for him because it involved European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. So this goes back to this idea that, we are more likely to empathize with people who have white skin. We're more likely to empathize with white people, and we're less likely to empathize with people who are more melanated, who are from, who we perceive, as different from us. So I've been having a lot of conversations with people about how it seems like the crises that are happening in different parts of the world aren't getting the same amount of sort of attention, right? And so some of you may know or may not know that there are wars currently happening and conflict currently happening in many African countries, including Sudan, including the Tigray region of Ethiopia, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, including Haiti. But when you look at what is being shown on the news, you don't see a lot of these conflicts being talked about. What dominates the headlines is the wars that are happening here, right? Or in what we perceive to be near, or the wars that are happening with people who have white skin. And so a lot of times these situations aren't getting the same amount of attention, because people have less empathy for folks that are Black or folks within the African diaspora. And so our ability to even empathize with different African communities is biased. So many claim that being able to actually see the harm committed against Black people will induce empathy. I've heard this a lot, right? Where in 2020, I heard a lot of people, I was reading a lot of things, and people were saying, we just need to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of Black people. We just need to be able to feel what Black people feel, right? And I think that that's a little bit misguided. And this quote is actually from the book. Because I feel it's misguided because empathy doesn't actually diminish our racist behaviors. Me feeling sorry for you or being able to put myself in your shoes doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to change the systems again and the structures that led to the oppression that you are experiencing. I think that these are some good examples, right? If it was true that all we needed to do was like put ourselves in the shoes of like George Floyd, or put ourselves in the shoes of Eric Garner, or put ourselves in the shoes of Rodney King, then we would have eradicated racism already, right? I remember, again, as a 90s baby, I remember hearing about Rodney King and watching, I was young when it happened, but watching the story of Rodney King, who was a man who was involved in a high-speed police chase in the early 90s. When the police caught up to him, they brutally beat him. And his beating was actually like the first, you could call it like viral video, or the first video of police brutality that was caught on film. And when the police ended up getting acquitted, there was riots in LA, and it was a big deal at the time. But I mean, if this was true, where all we have to do is put ourselves in the shoes of Black people, we just need to feel more empathy, then when we all saw the brutal beating of Rodney King on film, we should have made changes and things would have been better. But I think that, we keep seeing these stories and hearing these stories of people being brutalized, and it's not enough to put ourselves in their shoes, right? That doesn't actually change the systems that led to the harm that they experienced. So I think again that empathy is what our ability to empathize is white centered, and empathy itself is white centered, and we shouldn't be focusing so heavily on it. So I always like to talk about, when I think about this, I talk about how even our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of others is, I don't think we actually can do that, right? And I say that because I recently became a mother, and before becoming a mother or becoming a parent, there were a lot of things that, my mom would tell me. But as someone who wasn't, or who didn't have children, I didn't understand, right? And no matter how hard I tried to put myself in the shoes of a parent, there's just certain things that you just will never understand unless you are a parent, right? And I think that no matter how hard you try to put yourself in the shoes of George Floyd or Eric Garner, if you're a person who doesn't walk in this world as a Black man, there are just some things you'll never be able to understand. And so I think that even the act of trying to put ourselves in people's shoes is misguided, because I just don't think, I think I walk through the world as a woman. I will never fully understand what it's like to walk through this world as a man, right? And I think that that is something that is important to understand. And so no matter how hard I try, I will not understand or be able to empathize with the experiences of a man fully, right? And so I think that it's important for us also to understand the limitations of empathy. No matter how hard we try, some experiences we will just not be able to fully understand. In a workplace or from a workplace context, this shows up, especially after 2020, where a lot of people I spoke with had told me, Black people specifically had said that in their workplaces, their managers or leaders wanted them to share, like, what were your experiences with racism growing up? Tell us, right? So we can understand, so we can put ourselves in your shoes. And I actually think that this is highly problematic, because you having to share or reshare past traumas for the sake of white enlightenment is not going to be what moves your workplace or moves things forward. And so I think that also what happens a lot when we talk about empathy is that non-white people are expected to sort of exploit their trauma for the sake of learning for their white colleagues and coworkers. And I don't think that that ever leads to anything productive, right? So empathy is flawed and is biased, and it is not the thing that maybe we think it is, right? It has its utility, but again, our ability to even empathize with others is biased. So we should really be thinking about, like, well, what should we do instead, or what should we be feeling or doing instead of empathy? So what should we be focused on, or what can we do instead? I love this quote from Against Empathy, the Paul Bloom book that I mentioned earlier. And in the book, he said, we can actually be motivated to help people without empathy, right? So I can understand that this person who's asking for money needs help without having to put myself in their shoes, right? We can understand someone is in pain without actually feeling that pain ourselves. So empathy isn't necessary for us to help people and for us to support others. And so this idea that we have to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of others, I think is not actually accurate. I think we are able to support people and help them without actually having to feel empathy. So my main qualm with empathy is that empathy doesn't actually change systems. So instead of trying to empathize, I think a better strategy, and I talk about this in the book, is asking the question, number one, who is experiencing harm? Right? So in this particular situation, who is experiencing harm? And then asking the question, how can I best support those who are experiencing harm? Right? So who is it that is experiencing harm, and how can I best support those who are experiencing harm? And asking these two questions doesn't require us to empathize with anyone, right? Asking, how can I support you, doesn't require me to have to put myself in your shoes. So these two questions are really important. And I think that instead of focusing on empathy, we should really be focusing on these questions instead. So what does this look like in the workplace? Because after all, that's what the book is focused on, right? Decentering whiteness in the workplace. So instead of focusing on like how can we get our coworkers and colleagues and our managers to put themselves in the shoes of these more marginalized employee populations, we should be focusing on education, right? So understanding people's experiences. A lot of the discord in the workplace that I see as an equity consultant is because people have misunderstandings about other people's experiences. People don't know that this is what one person or one group of people are experiencing. And so education on what people are experiencing is so pivotal, because once we learn and we understand, oh, this is what someone is going through, this is what our trans employees are experiencing, or this is what the women in our workplace are experiencing, then we can create systems and interventions to address the harm and the situation and the issues that they are facing. And then also encouraging compassionate listening. And so when you think about compassionate listening, it's listening without the need to respond or provide advice. It's just listening to better understand how to support someone's experience. A really good example of this, I don't know if any of you follow Ijoma Olowu, who is the author of So You Want to Talk About Race. But I follow her on Instagram, and she talked about how there is a chapter in her book. She has her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, is a New York Times bestseller. And she talks about how there's a chapter where she talks about her hair. And so what she used to do is, I guess she used to do public book readings where she would read a part of her book in different, places in the public. And what she found was that when she would do the book reading, afterwards, there would be a line of white women that would be waiting to talk to her. And she said after she would, talk to them, they would all say, I understand what you went through. You talk about your experiences growing up with curly hair. I have curly hair as well. I can relate 100% to your experience. And she said, as a Black person, that was very dehumanizing to her, because she said, even though you have an experience that you may think is similar, like the desire that you feel to try to relate to my experience actually feels like you're invalidating my experience. And so I thought that was a really powerful example, right? I think when people tell us a problem or an issue or a situation, we just naturally, human nature, feel like we want to offer solutions or say, I understand how you feel. I know what you went through. I'll never forget, my mom said, there's shared an experience where she told somebody, my mother passed away, and someone was like, oh, I know how you feel, right? And so it's like, she's like, no, you don't know how I feel, right? And so this desire and need that we feel to try to relate to other people's experiences, we think is trying to help, right? But it can actually be invalidating to their experiences. And so compassionate listening instead focuses on how can we listen to what someone is going through without feeling the need to relate and say, oh, I know what you mean. I know, I understand that, right? Going back to this Paul Bloom quote, I love this quote where he said, we can be motivated to help others without empathy. We can understand someone is in pain without actually feeling that pain ourselves. Doctors don't need to feel the pain that their patients feel in order to support them and provide them with care and provide them with medicine to make them feel better and to heal them. And so we don't have to put ourselves in the shoes of others or empathize with them in order to provide people with the support that they need and the support that they desire. So I hope that was a effective and adequate explanation of why I feel like empathy is biased, why empathy is white-centered, and why we should move away from empathy, as well as what we should be focused on instead. So I want to pause here and see if anyone had any thoughts or questions or comments or just feedback on this whole discussion about empathy.
First, I want to give you a round of applause for your
Thank you, Dr. P. And I was trying to move around, and I had to remember that I'm being streamed. So hopefully I was able to give everyone eye contact, but that's the reason why I'm sticking right here. But did anyone have any thoughts or feedback or questions or yes?
Yeah, I mean, it was a great talk in general and brought up so many thoughts, but particularly that piece on like compassionate listening really resonated with me too. And I feel like that notion of, or that instinct that we have to say, oh, I understand how you feel, or oh yeah, it comes a lot from anxiety. I think from the person hearing the information, soothing their own anxiety, and so it requires us to kind of self-soothe instead of requiring the other person to kind of give us that satisfaction when the other person is in harm. But I was wondering, like as you were talking through, like how do we recenter? Like it talks listening, compassionate listening, but in education, but still like that thought of, you know, how do we get people to like educate themselves and be in a listening space without forcing minoritized people in the workplace to kind of expend themselves for the sake of that education. I wonder if you've done any trainings and organizations that have kind of attacked some of that without forcing people to kind of share their experiences of racism or share
No,
their
that's a
experiences.
really great question. And that's something I typically run into where minoritized or underrepresented racial groups or employees from those groups typically tell me, oh, I don't want to be part of this employee resource group, or I don't want to get engaged with the DEI stuff because I feel like I always have to exploit my trauma to, you know, for the sake of learning for my colleagues. And so I think that education is important where I don't think you have to like hear stories of someone's trauma to understand that they're in pain, right? And so for me, I'm big with like looking at the data where like what does, you know, I don't have to tell you that my family, you know, experienced housing discrimination for you to understand that housing discrimination is a real thing. I can show you the data. And so for me, I think data is a big thing where people are like, systemic racism doesn't exist. And I'm like, okay, it doesn't exist. So here is all of the data and the evidence, and the numbers don't lie. Here's all the evidence that indicates that there are these racial disparities when it comes to education or healthcare or, you know, all of these different systems within our society. So I think that that doesn't require anyone to exploit their trauma. But I think that especially after 2020 or during 2020, where we all just wanted to feel like we were doing something, it felt like, you know, hey, share what you went through, right? Without people fully understanding that like that wasn't actually like solving the bigger issue. So I think like rather than asking people to share parts of themselves that, you know, those past traumas, I think it's important to provide. There's so many resources, like there's so many podcasts, there's so many books, there's so many articles. And even like if any of you have gone through an experience in the workplace where, you know, maybe a colleague said something or did something that is offensive to a particular group, you shouldn't feel like you have to educate that colleague. I always just send people resources or podcasts, and I'm like, hey, you know, a good example is I had a conversation with a friend. He used the term nappy, right? And this friend is not Black, and he didn't understand why the term nappy was harmful and problematic. And I actually sent him an article, and I was like, let me know what you think about this article, and then we'll talk about it, right? And then we did talk about it, and we talked about how the term is racialized and is, you know, is only used on Black people and has negative connotations and all of these things. And so I think that also not feeling obligated as the only maybe whatever person to be, you know, educate those around you, and setting resources where you can or when you can is important. But also you don't have to set resources. You could just be like, I don't want to educate this person, and that's okay. I'm the type of person, I like to provide that education, but I don't think anyone should feel obligated. I know that was like a very long-winded answer, but hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Any thoughts? Any other? Yeah.
Well, I was on the empathy wagon.
Train. Yeah.
Train.
Or
Yeah,
drinking the
I was-
empathy
I
Kool-Aid,
was on the
right?
bullet train. That was cruising empathy. It's all we gotta get empathy as an educator for years. Going through your chapter and hearing you talk, very eye-opening, and I started to recognize a similar pattern with the notion that, you know, we talk about race and racism. It's very easy as an individual to say, well, I'm not a racist, therefore things are fine. And of course, if you're a racist or not, that's your business. And if you are in the workplace, well, then that's really a problem that will be addressed. Rather, it's the systemic stuff that is at issue. And so empathy is a very individualized act. And instead, recognizing that we can understand the positionality, the experiences of others, the pain of others, and not have to, that's where it gets to systemic. So
Yeah, exactly. No, and you hit the nail on the head. And so when people ask me, because I remember I wrote an article kind of like why I didn't agree with empathy, or it was like empathy is not going to eradicate racism. And a lot of people were like, but empathy is good, and essentially like you boiled it down very well. It's like empathy is an individual emotion, but it's not going to address systemic racism or systemic issues. If I feel sorry for you, if I put myself in your shoes, is that going to change the system that caused you harm? No, but it makes me feel better that I empathize with you or put myself in your shoes, but it doesn't actually, change the system. Someone actually pushed back when I had a conversation, or when I wrote the article, and they said, well, doesn't it take individuals to change the system? And don't you first need individuals to change the system? And while I do agree that individuals make up the system, I don't think empathy specifically is what's going to be what eradicates racism or changes the system. But I think you hit the nail on the head, where it's an individual emotion and doesn't address the systemic issues.
So how do you change the system then? It's obviously bias.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think you have to look at, going back to those questions of like, what is the harm that people are experiencing, and how can you best support those who are experiencing harm? So I think like in a good example, I just wrote an article about this, so it's at the top of my mind. The maternal mortality crisis is a big issue, right? Especially in New York City. If you look at the numbers in the Bronx, the numbers are abysmal of the amount of women that are dying, women and birthing people that are dying during childbirth, right? And so that is a systemic issue. So who is harmed, what populations are harmed, and what can be done to best support them is an important question. But I think the data tells us a lot of like what populations of people, what is it that, how do they not feel supported? Is it environmental issues? Is it poverty? It's a combination of these things. Is it the racial empathy bias, where they're reporting problems and not being listened to? And then how do we develop interventions that actually address those specific issues? And I don't think that addressing the issue requires us to like put ourselves in their shoes. I think it's important though that we're listening to those who are harmed. I think the problem is we're not always listening to the populations that are harmed. We're assuming we know what it is that they want. I had somebody that I went to school with, works at a university. The university had an issue that came up where they were in a faculty meeting and somebody posted a picture. It was like a meme or whatever, and it was supposed to be funny, but a lot of the Black faculty members found it to be offensive. And so this person that I went to school with, who works at this university, called me and says, hey, you're a DEI consultant, aren't you? Can you come in and help us? Because we have this issue. This is what happened. We want you to make that person that posted that picture apologize. And my first question was, what do the Black faculty members that were harmed want? And he's like, I don't know, we didn't ask them. We just thought that. So I think in a lot of situations, he just assumed that an apology was what was going to solve the issue. And he wasn't really centering or prioritizing like the needs of the people that were actually harmed. And so I think a huge part of like solving the issue is, who are those who are harmed and what do they want, or what do they need to feel supported? But a lot of times we don't ask that. We just say, this is what we think they need. And so I think prioritizing and centering those who are harmed and creating interventions to support them is what will help us solve the systemic issues.
Also, it's like changing culture as well.
Yeah.
Which I think
Very difficult
Yes.
to, and I'm thinking from like a change management and workplace context, just changing the culture is difficult, and one person isn't going to do that. Like, I have many thoughts, but I don't want to go into a tangent. But yeah, I think that that's a really good question of like, how do you change the systems? And I don't think it'll take one person. It takes multiple people. It takes specific policy change, right? Because even when you switch out the people, those same harmful policies are still in place. The same system will be recreated. So I think it takes policy change as well.
One of the things that I've noticed in the last few years here in New York is many African immigrants, it's a whole different culture that they experience back home than it has been for African Americans. So it's like trying to figure out, okay, that's a lot that's going on.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on that?
Just to add.
Sorry, everyone. This is my mom. So I asked, and she's also an African immigrant. So you said that, and I just thought that might be.
How much time do we have?
I know.
Not assume the need of this student are the same, or not student. I work with student. The need of this population is the same as African American. That's why there's always been a lot of tension, because even academically, some will find resources.
Yeah.
And it would be like they're taking resources from African American student over here. But when you go into it, I just wrote my dissertation on that actually. The needs are very, very different. And when we're talking about minority population, we belong all of them to the same content. We may have resources and say, well, if they're not doing well, it's because they're lazy.
Well, it's because
But
it's
that's
also
not-
a color-coded caste system, which basically immigrants don't divide as people.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that's a really good point where I think even like changing the system requires nuance. And I don't think that we have nuance in this country where I think, again, we lump everybody in together. I think I was following this whole thing with the Haitian migrants, and they say they're eating this and doing, when I saw that one of the people that they caught on video was it was a Black American person. And they were like, oh, they're Haitian and they're eating, and so it's like we lump everybody who is Black in the same category. There's no nuance. There's no, oh, this person is a descendant of enslaved people, or this person just came here, right, and is a documented person, or, oh, this person has been here for a few generations, but their parents came from Haiti. And so there's no nuance. And so when we think about like addressing systemic issues, what's really interesting that I learned, like with the maternal mortality crisis, is that African women who come here have better birthing outcomes than Black American women who've been here for generations. And so I didn't know that until I read this book called Pregnant While Black. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. But you would think that when you read the data that it applies to Black women across the board, but there's actually differences in Black women based on ethnic groups. So I think addressing systemic issues requires that nuance, but a lot of times we lump people into categories because that's just easier for us. But oh yeah, Dr. P.
Yeah, there was so much, like so many things that go through my head, but even just quickly in what you said is socialized, because when you said Black women outcomes, it was easy for me to just, anyone with melanated skin, that's who you're talking about. Born and raised in Alabama, it was not until I moved to Connecticut after college that I had even experienced differences, ethnic differences. Didn't know it was Black people and white people. And so when I came to Connecticut, and I heard people saying things like, oh no, I'm Greek, I'm Italian. And then for people who appeared Black to me to say, I'm Haitian, I'm Jamaican. It was a culture shock for me. But that wasn't what I wanted to mention. A few years back, I was working with a group of people in Brazil. And they were working on a mission statement about what they wanted the organization to accomplish. And they had taken a position that they wanted to help young people become, there were traits that they identified they wanted them to have. They literally spent the better part of 2 hours trying to choose between two words in Portuguese. One, compassion, which means simply empathy. But there's another word that they have at their disposal called complementarity. And that means empathy moved to action, basically, is the way it was explained to me. But kind of the technical is understanding, if I'm just using like Webster translation. But what you said resonated so with me going back to that, was that empathy is somewhat, you even said it is personal. And I don't think most of the time in these cases, people are looking for empathy. They are looking for the latter. We don't have one in English, but they're looking for, if you feel that it is wrong, I want you to be so moved by that you do something. And that's what they were saying. Like, we don't want kids to just to feel it and say, that's interesting. We want them, as they see injustice, as they see wrong happening, we want them to be moved to do something. And I think that's where we need to focus, is on the empathy side, is that I see it, I know it, I recognize it, I understand. And so now I'm going to, and even to your point about it's just not enough to see it. It's to dismantle those structures. And so maybe if people can focus, more and more people are focused on, that's wrong, what do we need to do to dismantle it? What do we need to do to dismantle that physicians are trained in such a way that they don't prescribe medicines consistently across racial groups? What do we need to do when people are assigning scholarship money, that they do that in such a way that is equitable, not just equal, but that's equitable? And so I like the idea, and that's the reason I was so happy when you talked about, you're going to talk about empathy, was that what really you validated for me in the way I was thinking about it was that we have been socialized this way, and we have to make a conscious effort to undo that socialization that we have. It's just there. And you said it at the very beginning that you don't have to have the right person in the room for that to happen. It happens.
Yeah. There's so much. Yeah, exactly. So I think when we ask ourselves, how do we address systemic issues, empathy is not what is going to be, because people have asked me, or someone asked me, well, why would you say racism, empathy will not help with racism? And I said, well, racism is a systemic issue, and empathy is an individualized emotion. Because you see, you read a lot of, I was reading a lot of Harvard Business Review articles on, addressing racism, and a lot of them mention empathy, right? If you look back from 2020, 2018, 2021, a lot of them talk about empathy among other sort of characteristics that are needed to address and eradicate racism. And I was just like, I go back to what you said, where it's like, empathy does nothing. It's not action oriented. It's like, this is what I feel, but what I feel is not changing the system. And so in Against Empathy, that book by Paul Bloom, he actually talks about compassion, right? It's, because some people are like, well, if empathy is not it, what do we do instead? He talks about how compassion is a little bit different from empathy. But I actually just think like asking the question of like, who is harmed and how can we best support them? And I think the data informs that, like, who is harmed, how can we best support them? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to add to the conversation that my mind goes to the two words care and connection. And I think that these can be building blocks, because especially in our society, if you don't have a connection with someone or an issue, you're less likely to care. And if you don't care, you're not going to advocate for some of those policy changes. And if you think about, like, sadly, mothers who've lost their children to drunk driving, right? They organize, they form a coalition, they find other people who have a connection to the issue, And I think it's a very powerful motivator for causing the chain reaction that leads to the eradication of some of these harmful systems. So I don't want to discount the importance of having a connection, and some of us have an easier time forming that than others, right? I worked in the anti-violence movement for a long time. It always bothered me when someone says, well, I have a daughter, right? Because you shouldn't have to have a daughter to care about sexual violence. But for a lot of people, they do. They need that. And so I don't want to completely discount the fact that it can help us get to where we're trying to go.
Yeah, that's a good point. But that last part where it's like you shouldn't have to, have it's like people will say, well, what if that was your mother or your daughter or your sister? You shouldn't have to, structure it or I guess state it like that for people to actually care about the harm that women experience, right? And so I think that, but the point you made is really good, where people sometimes only care more because it's something that hits closer to home for them. I have many more thoughts, but I don't want to ramble. So thank you for sharing that, though. Of course.
The compassion component. I do Toastmaster, and somebody did a speech, and I actually told her about it. She was talking, it was a speech about leading her about your mentor. And she said she learned that empathy from her mentor, but it wasn't necessarily conflicting because, position of leadership, you always say have empathy for those who are subordinate to you. But when you have empathy, you cannot be honest because it's brutal. If you have empathy, you cannot tell somebody you are doing a very bad job. But you have to have compassion. And she presented it, and I'm like, oh, so empathy in itself is not making us change the system. But when you have compassion, compassion is a behavior that you develop. Because I'm sitting here and saying, this is what I was actually thinking, because I wrote a lot about compassion, about empathy when I was doing my own. But compassion is a behavior that you develop when you're a child. My father taught us from day one, you have to, when they give you allowance money, you put a little bit on the side. For Sunday, you're going to go to church. He said, I'm not going to put it in money. You take what is important to you. And when it was time to collect, you collect clothes to give to the needy once a year. He asked you to go pick the clothes. He checked it. If you bring any raggedy thing, you're going to get it with it. You have to really say, why would you be giving what you don't want to somebody else? How would you feel if you were in their shoes? And so that is part of the compassion. Everything I do, I switch my life to say, I'm going to teach people how to be kind because I was. So, based on what you're saying, empathy is not enough. The compassion, that other component, we can teach. And that's my thinking. I was just discussing it with him. I want to go change the system somewhere and teach this in school to students to make it a requirement. If you're going to go, because I have a child going to having it's not necessarily the grade that count. You have extracurricular. They look at different things. When I went to VCU, when the counselor had telling us, we look at what the child did. So if you show evidence that you were doing this or that, she was gonna go to medical school. That's what was the plan. And they were telling us she done volunteer, even in animal shelter, even in homeless shelter. But you have to compassion in bottom line.
So what you said actually makes me think about whether empathy can be taught. And based on what you said, I actually don't think you can, like, how do you teach someone to put themselves in the shoes of others? So I think that that's interesting because now I'm thinking compassion is something that you can teach, but empathy is something that you can't teach. So that's also, to me, it just adds to there's many reasons we don't like empathy, but that just adds to why empathy is flawed. And I think it's because you can't teach someone to feel what someone else is feeling or to put themselves in someone else's shoes. So that was good. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
several different points in my career. I've always found the quickest, easiest way to address systemic racism is just to get it right. Just go straight to university, university, compliance we have. And until you do that, whenever what's going on in my experience, because it's not currently I do the person so hopefully articles and economists. I think it takes a good faith, that they won't be protections to that. I have the same feeling that they're absolutely going to be the person of color. I think we see it on a larger scale in the United States right now. The government, what's going on. And I want to, I guess, have a more hope for you. Do you believe that white leaders can be separate from others? I could say, what I've seen in my life, they can. I think, there's when you look at organizations, and it's usually said in market organizations, if there's a decision that's going to impact people, it will almost always, if there's a concentration of white leadership and white power, it could be the white boss, CEO, it could be majority of the employees are white. Once that happens, the decision making for X employee becomes beneficial to basically a white supremacist benefit the decision. So I guess you believe that white leaders can do something like this, and then are the organizations where we have seen this be successfully managed?
Yeah, that's such a good, and I appreciate your feedback and your sentiments. Yeah, sometimes the only way that a company is going to change is when they get sued, when they get hear from the EEOC. So as you were talking, I was thinking about, I believe it's Derek Bell who talks about the convergence theory, where he basically said the only way that non-white communities are going to experience progress is if their interests are also in the interests of white people, right? And so if I'm a white person or a group of white people and I see that this policy or practice will benefit us, that is the only way that I will move this forward. And so I don't know, Derek Bell is like a prolific scholar. So I don't want to say I disagree, because I do think that in a lot of cases that's true. But I also try to be like Angela Davis said, we have to remain optimistic. I do feel like white leaders have the ability to change. Do I see it often? No. Do I think that a lot of companies aren't even at the point where they're ready to decenter whiteness? They're still at the point where they are arguing about whether they're a white supremacist organization. And I think we live in a society where the air that we breathe is the system of whiteness, right? And so I think that if for me as a Black person who's recognized how I center whiteness, it's hard for me to decenter whiteness. I can only imagine for someone who is white. And so I think that it is possible, but it is very difficult. But I do think that there are people, white leaders, that are willing, but I think that the system that they're in the workplace makes it very difficult, because as one person who's trying to decenter whiteness, even as a white leader, you have so many, and in the book I talk about it, you have so many barriers, right? Even when you have power and you have access and you have privilege, there are other people who there's that resistance, especially now. I think what we're seeing, there's more and more resistance where people can acknowledge, okay, these are Eurocentric policies and practices, but they are not going to do anything to actually shift or change the policies within the system. So I do think that it's possible, but I think it's difficult. But I like to remain optimistic that people will change or are willing to change. What gives me some sort of comfort is knowing how the racial demographics in this country are shifting, and how by 2045, by 20 years from now, we will be a majority, demographers predict will be majority non-white. And I do think that a lot of the Gen Z and millennial generations want to work for companies that are, I hate to use the term woke, because folks have sort of like vilify that term, but a lot of these younger generations want companies that prioritize these things. They don't want to be affiliated or work for companies that aren't prioritizing equity and justice. And so I do think that the people that are coming up are even more vocal than previous generations. And I think that the consistently holding these companies to task is what's going to be what causes the change. But I think the change is slow.
You can see it to some degree, even though it's a little about culture. And you definitely see more commercials on TV or streaming with either a black man, black woman, or a white man, black woman.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's definitely I see a lot more interracial like couples, which is interesting. I think that there's a lot of surface level things that have been done as far as like diversity, where sometimes like as somebody who's a DEI consultant, I'll watch a show and I'll be like, there were no black people in the like in the medieval time. Like I don't remember what show I was watching, and I was like, this is weird, but I get it, like I get it. But I think to go back to your question, I do think that it's possible for white leaders to change, but I think that it's rare and it's difficult and it doesn't happen often.
One quickly follow up, you said, I think, what you said about, was it Derek Bell?
Mhm.
You know,
I think it's called interest convergence or convergence theory.
when I look at what I see in the workplace across different workplaces, and especially if you're someone who's on the HR side, who's you see it more often, I think what happens in organizations, there's a decision and what is beneficial to black, brown, LGBT, it's viewed as them, being harmful to like, the system rights or whoever's impact. And I think what I see the most obvious example to me now is like the remote work discussion. And so many studies, who wants to go back to the workplace is mostly, older white men, right? Who doesn't want to go back? Basically everyone else. And this is absent of these discussions, or these discussions that, we need because of X, Y, Z. I think white supremacy workplace has the ability to operate invisibly. It's present, and no one wants to say, this is what systemic racism looks like, In the job interviews, when people say, we're looking for someone who's a cultural fit. No, you're reinforcing your bias, which is not racial. So, there's so many ways I think that it manifests. When I've seen a lot of organizations with teams kind of come and go, and if there's a tipping point of whiteness, which you see in the routine form is they create this white centered experience that's based on like social relationships. So it's who am I friends with, who are we, going to talk at the work, who are we going to talk about our vacations and talking or whatever. And when I think about that, I think, it's affiliation bias, right? We're making things in workplace. And I think of like, how do I identify these ways and exit myself from that so I'm not participating in this kind of systemic behavior? But a friend of mine, she said, to many white people, the success in the workplace looks like being friends with people. And to many people of color, it was showing up and doing their job. And now there's so many TikToks and things where they kind of, examples of things that happen in the workplace. And I always think of that when I see something like that, because the whole like, you're the silent, black or brown person, you must have an attitude problem. Like this is so many people's experience, right? You show up, you're doing your job, you'd be doing the best job, but because you're not engaging in this pro-white supremacy behavior, now you're viewed as not fit, even though there may be some other low performers who are just socializing. When you're coming up against white supremacy, you can lose. I think, maybe on the hopefulness note, the younger generations in the workplace, I'll never forget this. There was a national kind of leader that was giving a talk and said, when you're hiring someone, my best advice is always go with your gut. If you have a gut feeling about someone, go with that. And, my young colleague raised their hand and pointed out, that sounds like a great way to increase bias and discrimination. And everyone was shook. It was like you could hear a pin drop. And this person said, I didn't mean it that way. Of course, it became very awkward, but I do love that, the newer generation of, workers in the workplace are willing to openly confront these things and challenge, and hopefully there's some hope there.
Yeah, and I think companies that don't prioritize equity and justice, I feel like they're not going to be sustainable, because it's what people want to work in a workplace that cares about its employees at the end of the day, right? That is not going to harm different communities of employees. And there was a study that was done where they found that even when you're not the victim of discrimination or workplace harm, when you witness it, that lowers your commitment to the workplace, right? So if you see Joe Schmo, getting talked down to or experiencing harm, it affects your commitment to the job. And so I think that from a sustainability standpoint, companies are in business to make money. And so I hate to go back to, I hate the business case for diversity, but at the end of the day, if you want to stay in business and be profitable, people don't want to support a company that doesn't care about its employees. People don't want to buy from a company that doesn't care about its employees. To this day, it's still a struggle for me to go to Chick-fil-A because, I remember in 2012, when I was moving from Louisiana to New York, all of the backlash from, the CEO who said, whatever about the LGBTQIA plus community. And so still it's a struggle for me over 10 years later to want to support and go to Chick-fil-A. And so I think about, when these things happen, they do have long-term impacts and implications. I personally don't know if Starbucks is ever going to bounce back from this period that they're in, right? And I think that there are longer term implications. And so there's a quote that does keep me hopeful from this Black British author named Rennie Ito Lodge, who says, every voice raised up against racism chips away at its power. And I do think that, even if you're the person that has to make a stand in the workplace and then you get fired, I do think that those small actions contribute to the larger systemic change that will happen in the workplace. And so, even when it seems like nothing is happening or the change is slow and meandering, I do think that, things are happening slowly overall in the long term. So.
Thank you. Let's give Dr. Gosnell
And of course, I have more books than people, but you can take a bunch. I have books here to give away, so you can give them to friends and family. I also think it's a nice sort of way to get people interested. If you have an office and you just put one on your desk, people will walk in and be like, Decentering Whiteness, what is that? Oh. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
I'm excited to read your book.
Yes, I hope you like it. Give it some friends.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you for coming.